This is what happens when we don't follow protocol, people. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before the entire hospital would learn who Katie Rodriguez really was. Seattle General in Portland hums with fluorescent lights reflecting off polished linoleum, the kind of institutional brightness that erases shadows and makes everyone look slightly corpse-like. The sharp bite of antiseptic mixes with burnt coffee from the nurse's station, where someone left a mug cold enough to grow its own ecosystem. Katie Rodriguez moves through the ICU with a kind of quiet efficiency that makes her invisible, which is exactly how she prefers it. 8 months into her nursing position, she has perfected the art of being unremarkable, the nurse you don't notice, the one who doesn't interrupt, the woman in the corner restocking supplies with hands that never shake and eyes that never quite meet yours. Her long sleeves cover scars that ladder up both forearms like a topographical map of a war nobody knows about. The scars are white and old, rope-thick in places, and when she thinks no one is watching, she catches herself tracing one with her opposite thumb, a gesture so automatic she barely registers it. The limp favors her left leg on days when the Portland rain hits too hard, and she's learned to time her breaks for those moments, when the hallways are emptiest. In her scrub pocket, buried beneath the pens and the small notebook where she tracks every medication dispensed and every dosage verified, Katie keeps a tarnished military challenge coin. She touches it the way other people touch rosaries. The coin is the only physical proof that she ever served at all. The only proof that Katie Rodriguez was once someone else entirely, someone with a call sign and a rank and a string of commendations that technically don't exist anymore because the missions they decorated never happened officially. She pulls the coin out now, standing alone in the medication storage closet, turning it over twice, a habit from another life, before tucking it back into her pocket like contraband. The ICU is unusually full this evening. Post-op recoveries, 2 trauma admissions from a highway collision, and 1 new arrival in room 347 that Katie notices immediately, Air Force Colonel Paul Hendricks, cardiac surgery 6 hours prior, his vitals still stabilizing under the careful watch of the monitors. When she enters to check his blood pressure cuff and verify his foresight, the first thing she sees is his right forearm, the tattoo visible above the blanket line. The letters are in military stencil font, precise and deliberate, Rodriguez. Katie's hand stills on the 4 line. The colonel's eyes are glassy from painkillers, his pupils slightly dilated, his focus drifting across the ceiling with the loose attention of someone not quite present. He glances toward her badge, Katie Rodriguez, RN, and something flickers across his expression, a moment of recognition trying to form before the medication pulls it back under. His lips move slightly, as if he's about to say something, but then his eyes drift away and the moment collapses. Katie finishes checking his vitals without speaking, the sounds of the monitors beeping their steady rhythm the only language either of them needs right now. Blood pressure stable. Oxygen saturation adequate. Heart rhythm normal. All the numbers that mean survival. She leaves room 347 without looking back. The nurse's station is chaos, as always, 3 nurses managing 14 beds, the phone ringing constantly, a resident asking questions nobody has time to answer properly. Katie positions herself at the terminal, pulling up the medication dispensary logs and the billing records for her assigned patients. This is the part of nursing that most people don't understand, the part that happens in the quiet spaces between the dramatic moments. Reading. Checking. Verifying. The things nobody thanks you for because they're invisible when done correctly. It's in the billing records that Katie sees it first, a consultation charge for Dr. Whitfield on Colonel Hendricks' account. Cardiology consult, $800. The problem is that Katie was present during pre-op yesterday, and Whitfield never consulted on this case. The attending cardiologist was Dr. Chen, who's written her name on the chart. Katie pulls up more records, her fingers moving quickly now, habit and training overriding the need to be invisible. 3 more charges. 4. 5. Each one inflated beyond what the procedure codes allow, each one carrying Whitfield's signature, each one routed through a phantom consulting firm she doesn't recognize. Her jaw tightens slightly. The sound of expensive shoes clicking on tile announces his arrival before she even looks up. Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrives for evening rounds like he's arrived for every round in her 8 months here, with the kind of confidence that comes from never being questioned, never being doubted, never having to wonder if people believe him. He's 48, silver-haired, the type of handsome that comes from personal trainers and dermatologists, with a voice like a tank idling in a garage. Powerful. Constant. Hard to ignore. And right now, his eyes are on Katie. He's not alone. Whitfield brings the evening's entourage, 5 residents in their short white coats, still young enough to believe that confidence equals competence, still naive enough to write down everything this man says as though it's scripture. They cluster around him like electrons orbiting a nucleus, and Katie has learned to recognize the exact moment when she becomes useful to his narrative. "Gentlemen," Whitfield says, his voice carrying across the unit with the ease of someone accustomed to being heard. "Let's talk about medication protocol failures. Let's talk about what happens when our nursing staff doesn't take inventory seriously." Katie's hands don't pause. She continues scanning medication vials, checking serial numbers, marking them on her log. This is the performance. This is the part where she disappears. "Ms. Rodriguez," Whitfield gestures toward her station, and the residents' eyes swivel in unison. "Perfect example. Just last week, we discovered a discrepancy in her narcotic count. A fentanyl patch unit missing from the dispensary. Never found. Never accounted for." The words are precisely calibrated lies. The fentanyl count was verified 3 times. Katie found the missing patch herself, tucked behind a shelf, probably dropped during a med change. She reported it, documented it, and the incident was resolved. But that's not the story that serves Whitfield's purpose. He needs these young doctors to understand that Katie is unreliable, that her diligence is a cover for incompetence, that her presence at the medication station is a liability rather than an asset. "This is what happens," Whitfield continues, his tone professorial now, "when we don't have adequate oversight. When we trust people to manage controlled substances without constant supervision. Protocols exist for a reason, people." One of the residents glances at Katie and immediately looks away, unwilling to meet her eyes. The social death has been administered with surgical precision. Katie marks another medication in her log, her handwriting steady and precise. The only sign of her composure is the slight pause between one line and the next, the smallest gap where her breathing stills for half a second. "Carry on, Ms. Rodriguez," Whitfield says, already turning back to his residents. "Try not to misplace anything else this evening." The click of his shoes fades down the hallway, the residents following like ducklings, their conversation immediately shifting to rounds, labs, discharge plans. By tomorrow, the story will have spread through the hospital. By next week, Katie's reputation will be permanently stained. This is how Whitfield operates. This is his first layer of control, not direct confrontation, but the slow erosion of credibility, the creation of narrative momentum that no individual objection can withstand. Katie finishes her medication log at 1933. Everything accounted for. Everything verified twice. Everything correct in the way that only people who have been trained in absolute precision understand the meaning of the word correct. She works until the evening shift becomes the night shift, until the unit settles into the darker rhythms of post-midnight medicine, until the hallways are empty enough to think. At 23:34, she clocks out and walks to the supply closet on the 4th floor, the one that nobody uses anymore, the one with the broken light that casts everything in navy blue shadow. It's here that her hands finally shake. She pulls out the challenge coin, tarnished silver, worn smooth by years of handling, and stares at it in the darkness. The seal of her unit is barely visible on the face, the motto too faded to read. 21 years ago, she was handed this coin by a command master chief whose name is no longer important because that entire mission was erased from official records. 13 months of covert operations. 14 personnel. 3 casualty reports that list her as deceased. 1 explosion in Baghdad that killed everyone she supposedly worked with and officially ended her life. Except Katie Rodriguez is standing in a supply closet at Seattle General in Portland, restocking medication, and taking abuse from a man who doesn't know he's standing 3 feet away from someone who once led a 10-person team through 72 hours of continuous combat in a city that technically never hosted the operation she participated in. The challenge coin catches what little light exists in the closet and throws it back like a small mirror. Katie's thumb crosses the worn surface, a gesture that has become prayer, meditation, and anchor all at once. There's a soft sound then, almost inaudible, the kind of noise that only someone trained to hear the difference between ambient sound and intentional sound would notice. Footsteps. Deliberate. Moving closer. Then stopping just outside the closet door. Katie's hand still immediately. The coin goes back into her pocket. Her body language shifts from human vulnerability to something else entirely, something that lives just beneath the surface of her daily composure. The closet door opens. Dr. Whitfield stands silhouetted against the hallway light, his shadow stretching toward her like an accusation. "Ms. Rodriguez," he says, and the tone is different now. Lighter. Almost intimate. "We need to talk about your employment status." The medication cart sat outside Bay 4 like evidence at a crime scene, and Dr. Marcus Whitfield had decided it was time to make an example of it. "Gather around, people," he called to the assembled residents during morning grand rounds, his voice carrying the particular brightness of a man about to perform cruelty as pedagogy. 12 interns materialized around him like magnets drawn to authority, pens poised over their notepads. Katie Rodriguez didn't look up from the supply shelf she was restocking, though her shoulders registered the shift in air pressure that always preceded Whitfield's performances. "This," Whitfield announced, gesturing dramatically at Katie's cart with the flourish of a stage magician revealing a carcass, "is what happens when we don't follow protocol. Nurse Rodriguez here seems to believe that documentation is optional. Flexible guidelines. A suggestion rather than a requirement." He picked up a medication bottle with 2 fingers, as though handling something contaminated. "Look at this chart. Cosign missing on the controlled substance count from 3 days ago. Missing. Completely absent. This is negligence wearing scrubs." Katie had restocked that bottle herself. She had checked and double-checked the documentation. She had watched Whitfield pocket that same bottle from the narcotic drawer on Tuesday morning at 7:43 a.m. while she was retrieving syringes from the locked cabinet. But her jaw tightened, just barely, just enough that only her own proprioception registered the muscle flex, and she continued sliding 4 bags into their slots with methodical precision. "The thing is," Whitfield continued, warming to his audience now, "floor nurses don't always understand the complexity of hospital systems. They come from various backgrounds, various training environments, and sometimes those foundational gaps in knowledge manifest exactly like this." He gestured at the cart again, at her, with the same indifferent motion. "So we remain vigilant. We document. We verify. Because patient safety depends on competence, and competence requires education." One of the interns, a young woman with kind eyes, glanced at Katie with something that might have been sympathy. Katie didn't meet her gaze. She simply continued working, her hands steady as surgical lasers, her face a professionally neutral mask that would have fooled anyone who didn't know that beneath her scrubs, her fingers were leaving marks on her palms from her fingernails pressing into skin. Whitfield moved the rounds along, but his message was clear, and he knew it. By lunch, 3 other nurses would have heard the story. By end of shift, it would be hospital folklore, Nightingale Rodriguez with her gaps in training, her questionable competence, her sloppy documentation. The narrative was already growing teeth. The vending machine incident happened at 12:41 p.m., in that narrow hallway outside the break room where fluorescent lights hummed like trapped wasps. Katie was retrieving her lunch, a container of rice and vegetables she'd prepared at 5 a.m., when Whitfield appeared beside her with 4 other nurses in his orbit, the way he always did when he wanted witnesses. "Tell me something," he said, his voice pitched to carry casual cruelty. "Did they even teach basic pharmacology at whatever online diploma mill you attended? Because your charting suggests a fundamental gap in understanding drug interactions. Real fundamental." The 4 nurses suddenly became very interested in the vending machine's offerings. One of them, Janet, who'd been kind to Katie during orientation, studied the row of chips with the intensity of a jeweler examining diamonds. Katie closed her locker with the kind of deliberate quietness that required actual effort not to slam. When she spoke, her voice was level and clear, drained of effect like a radio transmission. "My documentation follows hospital protocol, Dr. Whitfield. Sensitivity to feedback, people, that's something worth noting in your professional development goals," Whitfield called after her as she walked away, his tone suggesting that sensitivity to feedback was synonymous with defensive incompetence. Some of us don't handle correction well. Katie didn't look back. She walked down the corridor with her hands visible, her breathing controlled, her footsteps measured at exactly the pace of someone who was absolutely fine, who wasn't fighting the tremor that lived in her sternum like something caged. Alone in the stairwell 3 minutes later, she let her fingers find the challenge coin in her scrub pocket, the tarnished brass disc worn smooth by 14 years of carrying it, a piece of shrapnel from a Black Hawk's fuselage welded into its center, the only physical proof she'd ever served. She gripped it hard enough to feel the metal bite into her skin. The third humiliation arrived at 3:22 p.m., during evening medication administration, when Colonel Paul Hendricks, the man with her name tattooed on his right forearm, the man who was supposed to be dead in a report that was supposed to never exist, was prescribed a dosage of post-operative pain medication that didn't match his weight, his vitals, or his medical history. Katie checked the order 3 times. Her fingers traced the numbers on the screen, reading the decimal points, confirming the dose. 50 milliliters. For a post-op patient at 190 pounds. For someone whose respiratory rate was already dropping toward the basement at 14 breaths per minute. Her military training knew the difference between careful prescribing and careless pharmacology. Her military training recognized the signature of someone testing boundaries, someone escalating. She walked to the nurse's station and questioned it out loud. "Dr. Whitfield, this dosage seems elevated for his weight. Can I clarify Are you actually questioning my clinical judgment?" His voice cut across the station like a scalpel. The charge nurse looked up. 3 other nurses stopped charting. The entire shift went still, the way prey animals go still when they sense a predator. You, a floor nurse with barely a year's experience. This is exactly why we have hierarchies, Nightingale. Exactly why some people don't have authority. He used the derogatory nickname deliberately, rolling it across his tongue with practiced contempt. Nightingale, something delicate, something that sang in cages, something small and decorative. Something without teeth. Katie said, "I'll administer as ordered, doctor," her voice completely empty of inflection, a voice that belonged to no one, and turned to prepare the medication while Whitfield delivered his closing remark to the charge nurse with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Some people don't know their place. That night, alone in the supply closet during inventory, Katie's hands finally trembled. Her fingers gripped the edge of the metal shelving hard enough that she felt her joints compress, her bones press against skin. She allowed herself exactly 10 seconds, she counted them, disciplined even in her breaking point, of closed eyes and controlled breathing, the kind of breathing she'd learned in deserts and mountains, the kind that kept you functional when everything inside was fracturing. 10 seconds. Then her composure returned like a door closing, latching shut with the kind of finality that suggested it wouldn't open again. What Katie didn't know, Whitfield had made his calls. The first at 1:15 p.m. to a board member named Sterling, a man who owed Whitfield favors from a malpractice cover-up 3 years prior. The second at 2:02 p.m. to a private investigator named Graves, the kind of man who specialized in background verification, in finding inconsistencies, in unraveling invented histories. Because Whitfield had begun to notice the way Katie read charts, too thorough, too systematic, patterns that suggested she wasn't just a nurse but someone trained to recognize fraud patterns at institutional levels. She'd started asking questions about his billing codes, his pharmaceutical orders, his routing of veteran patients through unnecessary consultations that always somehow billed to mysterious offshore accounts. What Whitfield didn't know, Katie had already documented everything. Every suspicious order. Every inflated code. Every phantom consulting firm invoice. Everything was catalogued in a secure cloud storage accessible only to her and someone in the Pentagon whose phone number she'd memorized in 2009 and never forgotten. The waiting game was about to enter a new phase, and neither of them understood that Colonel Hendricks upstairs in room 347 was already the catalyst, already the spark that would burn everything down. The code blue alarm erupted from room 347 at 2:11 a.m., a sound that split the night shift into two kinds of people, those who moved and those who froze. Katie heard it from the medication dispensary 3 floors below, and her body responded before her mind registered the location. Stairwell over elevator. 42 seconds to the ICU. She was moving before the second alarm pulse finished its shriek, her scrubs catching air like a sail as she accelerated down the corridor, past the resident frozen in the doorway of room 347, past the crash cart still being rolled from the supply room, past the confusion that always came in those first 10 seconds when adrenaline hadn't yet crystallized into purpose. She saw Colonel Hendricks gasping like a man drowning in air, his chest heaving against the pull of his own failing heart, and the clinical picture assembled itself in her vision with the clarity that only came from having performed triage under mortar fire. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins. The kind of breathing that meant the chambers couldn't fill because something was pressing down from the outside, suffocating the heart from within. Cardiac tamponade. Blood in the pericardial sac. 5 minutes until his pressure crashed below sustaining levels. Maybe 10 if luck was having a generous night. Pericardiocentesis kit. Now, she called to the night staff, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed by people with guns. Not a request. Not a question. A command structured like a door that didn't open any other way. The charge nurse's eyes snapped toward her, registering surprise and then something that looked like recognition, the same look people got when they suddenly understood they were standing next to someone operating at a different frequency entirely. Katie's left hand was already drawing up lidocaine from the crash cart, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of 200 procedures performed in field hospitals where the anesthesia was whatever was in the bag and the operating table was a concrete floor. 1 milligram per kilogram, local infiltration, precision work in a space the size of a postage stamp between the 4th and 5th ribs. The kit arrived in someone's hands. Probably the resident. Katie didn't look. She was already positioning the ultrasound probe against Hendricks' sternum, finding the echo window that would show her the blood pooling around his heart like water filling a closed fist. There. The fluid dark and thick on the screen, pressing the right atrium flat. Pressure tamponade. Every beat of his heart was fighting against a closed system. She prepped the skin with antiseptic solution, felt it dry against her fingers, and her hands moved with the terrible grace of someone who had done this in the dark using a headlamp from a Marine's rifle, someone who understood that hesitation was the only real enemy in a moment like this. 60 milliliter syringe. 18-gauge needle, she said, and the equipment materialized the way equipment always did when people believed you knew what you were doing. Her palpating fingers found the landmarks, the 5th intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the exact geography of Hendricks' ribcage that would lead her to the pericardial sac without collapsing a lung or perforating the right ventricle. She could feel the night shift watching from the doorway, could sense the attending physician's confusion at being bypassed, could taste the electricity in the room that meant something extraordinary was happening and everyone was conscious of it except the man whose life was balanced on the point of a needle. The needle advanced through skin, muscle, pericardial membrane. The slight give as it penetrated. Her fingers steady as surgical steel. The syringe attached and drawn back with controlled pressure, and then it came, the blood. Dark red, nearly black, pouring into the barrel with the visual weight of a life being given back. 30 milliliters. 40. 50. The monitors screaming different tones as Hendricks' heart suddenly had room to beat again, as pressure dropped back into the chambers, as his oxygen saturation began climbing from the devastating low of 68%. 72. 80. 88. The rhythm stabilizing on the monitor from the chaotic pattern of a suffocating heart to the clean spike and dip of sinus rhythm. The room exhaled. Literally. All that held breath released at once, a physical sound like a door opening to daylight. Katie withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd used to insert it, applied pressure to the site, and stepped back. Get cardiology on the phone. He'll need echo follow-up within the hour and they need to be ready for possible pericardiotomy if this tamponade recurs, she said to the charge nurse, her voice already modulating back to the professional register of someone who took orders and gave recommendations, not someone who'd just held death at bay with her bare hands. The attending physician stood frozen in the corner, his mouth working without sound, and Katie didn't look at him. She didn't look at the resident. She simply moved to the medication cart she'd been pushing when the alarm started, tallied the remaining count in her head, every single dose accounted for, every single number perfect, and continued her night as though the last 8 minutes hadn't fundamentally altered something in the atmosphere of Seattle General. By 6:15 a.m., the cardiothoracic surgeon had arrived, reviewed the ultrasound images, and confirmed what the entire night shift already knew: another 10 minutes and Hendrick's pericardial pressure would have crushed his ventricles into uselessness. Katie's intervention had been the difference between a man walking out of this hospital and a man being transported to the morgue. The day shift was already talking about it, the story spreading through the corridors with the velocity of genuine amazement, the quiet nurse with the medication cart who'd recognized something the residents missed, who'd moved with absolute certainty, who'd probably saved a man's life at 2:13 a.m. while everyone else was still processing what was happening. Katie deflected the praise with a slight nod and returned to her regular duties, restocking the ICU supplies as though she'd done nothing more remarkable than process a standard medication order. "Good work in there," the charge nurse said, and Katie's response was already prepared, minimal, humble, just doing the job. Her hand steady as she organized the drawers, muscle memory, and focused the only things visible on the surface. Inside, she was already calculating the exposure. An advanced emergency procedure. A pericardiocentesis performed without authorization from an attending physician. Competence that raised questions about her background, her training, her education. The careful invisibility she'd maintained for 8 months was developing cracks, and she could feel the pressure building behind those cracks like water behind a dam. At 7:15 a.m., Dr. Whitfield arrived at Seattle General looking crisp and early, moving through the morning routine with the confidence of a man comfortable in his superiority. The charge nurse pulled him aside near the physician's lounge to tell him about the code blue, about Katie's intervention, about the cardiac tamponade she'd recognized and treated with an advanced procedure that probably shouldn't have been performed by a floor nurse. Katie watched from a distance, pretending to inventory medication, and saw the exact moment Whitfield's face went carefully blank. The implications registering. The same nurse who'd questioned his medication orders. The same nurse whose personnel file had been oddly sparse when he'd called HR last week requesting it. The same nurse who'd been meticulously reviewing billing codes, who'd noticed the phantom patient he'd written up, who had the kind of attention to detail that could burn down a man's entire career if she decided to speak. He made a decision in that moment, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly before his expression settled back into something resembling concern. He pulled the charge nurse into a side conversation, his voice low, and Katie heard him say, "I need to report a controlled substance discrepancy. Last night during the code, in all the chaos, I noticed the narcotic count from Rodriguez's cart doesn't match the log." The charge nurse's eyebrows drew together in confusion. Dr. Whitfield, Katie's counts are always perfect, but he cut her off with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd made accusations before and understood how to structure them so they couldn't be easily dismissed. "Are you telling me you won't investigate a potential diversion?" "Because I'm happy to escalate this to the board. We have to take these matters seriously." The charge nurse's expression shifted from confusion to discomfort, the institutional machinery already beginning to turn. By 9 a.m., Katie was sitting in a meeting with the nurse manager and the security chief, blindsided by accusations she'd anticipated but never quite believed would land. Missing narcotics. A discrepancy in her count. An investigation. Protocol. The words fell into the space between them like stones. She opened her mouth to explain, to say that she'd watched Whitfield pocket those same medications 2 days ago, to lay out the entire scheme of fabricated billing and phantom patients. But she closed her mouth again without speaking, because accusing an attending physician of theft required proof, and proof required discovery, and discovery required her to remain in the system long enough to gather it. Her invented background, the nursing credentials verified through carefully constructed documentation, the references who would confirm her story only as long as she didn't need them to survive serious scrutiny, would disintegrate under the pressure of a formal investigation. A background check. A deep dive into her medical school records or nursing certifications. The Pentagon had erased her once already. It couldn't do it twice. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice steady as concrete. Just those 5 words. No defense, no anger, no desperation. Just the flat statement of fact delivered with the composure of someone who'd already survived worse interrogations in rooms where the consequences were measured in rounds and shrapnel. The nurse manager looked pained, genuinely uncomfortable with the next word she had to speak. "Katie, we have to put you on administrative leave pending investigation. It's protocol. You understand?" Not a question. Protocol always protected the institution first. Katie nodded once, gathered her things, and security walked her to her locker while day shift nurses watched in shocked silence, the same nurses who'd spent the night praising her quick thinking, her medical knowledge, her presence of mind. The trap had been set and sprung with the efficiency of a man who understood how to weaponize institutional procedures. She could see Whitfield observing from his office window 3 floors up, his face arranged in an expression of regretful concern, already mentally composing the email to the state licensing board that would question her credentials, plant doubt about her training, ensure that even if she survived this, the damage to her credibility would be permanent. Whitfield watched from his office window 3 floors up as the monitors came back to life, as Katie's hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this in conditions far worse than sterile hospital lighting, as the entire night shift stood paralyzed in the doorway while a floor nurse performed a procedure that belonged in an ICU. His face arranged itself into an expression of regretful concern, the mask of a man observing a tragedy he'd tried to prevent, but his left hand was already reaching for his phone. The tap of his Mont Blanc pen against the mahogany desk was rhythmic, almost musical, as he scrolled through his contact list. 3 calls. That's all it would take. Board member Harrison owed him for the credentialing recommendation that had fast-tracked his appointment. Board member Chen needed his vote on the surgical expansion, a vote he could easily redirect if cooperation wasn't forthcoming. Board member Reeves had already been softened by 2 years of carefully cultivated relationship. By the time Katie finished aspirating the pericardial fluid, Whitfield had already composed the first email in his head. Fabricated concerns about her credentials. Questions about her training pathway. Suggestions that her intervention tonight, while well-intentioned, represented a dangerous scope of practice violation. A mandatory investigation. An administrative leave pending review. He'd learned long ago that institutions moved like glacier ice, slow, inevitable, crushing everything in their path once they began. The first call took 12 minutes. "Marcus, good to hear from you. How's the hospital?" Harrison's voice carried the familiar warmth of a man who believed they were allies. "I need your counsel on something delicate, Jim. One of our nurses performed a procedure tonight without authorization. Advanced stuff, pericardiocentesis, the kind of thing that should have required cardiothoracic involvement. I'm concerned about liability, about credential verification. I'm going to have to recommend a formal investigation, but I wanted the board to understand this is coming from a place of institutional protection, not personal vendetta." The pause on the other end was exactly the right length. "Of course, Marcus. I'll speak to the others. We need to protect the hospital first." The second call was smoother. Chen practically offered her support before he'd finished the setup. The third took longer. Reeves wanted details, wanted to understand the scope of the liability, but by the end of the conversation, Whitfield had commitments from all 3. Board member Harrison would push for immediate administrative review. Board member Chen would ensure that any investigation moved with institutional momentum. Board member Reeves would quietly suggest to the licensing board that credential verification for this particular nurse might warrant their attention. By 3:15 a.m., Whitfield had drafted the email to the state licensing board. He kept it clinical, kept it concerned, kept it deniable. During a patient emergency this evening, a registered nurse employed at Seattle General performed an advanced invasive procedure, emergency pericardiocentesis, without attending physician authorization or documented evidence of advanced certification. While the patient outcome was positive, this raises significant questions about credential verification, training pathway transparency, and scope of practice boundaries. We are conducting an internal review and wanted to alert your office proactively in case credential gaps have been missed during initial licensure verification. He read it 3 times, edited it once to soften the language further, then scheduled it to send at 7:53 a.m., after he'd already been seen on the floor expressing concern about the situation, after witnesses had observed his professional demeanor in the face of a troubling incident. The private investigator was easier. He was always on retainer, always available, always eager to dig into whatever background story Whitfield requested. I need you to pull everything on Catherine Rodriguez, RN at Seattle General. Background, credentials, training history, personal background, financial records. There are inconsistencies in her file and I need them documented. The investigator didn't ask questions. He never did. Men like that understood that institutional power flowed to those who could use information strategically. By the time the sun rose, a machine had been set in motion that no amount of medical competence could stop. The termination letter arrived in Katie's email at 1:02 p.m., with a copy on her locker by 2:15 when she returned from the staff break room where she'd been avoiding eye contact with nurses who suddenly couldn't meet her gaze. Effective immediately, your employment at Seattle General is suspended pending the outcome of multiple investigations, alleged diversion of controlled substances, scope of practice violations, and credential verification inconsistencies. You are to surrender your badge, access codes, and identification upon exit. Human Resources will conduct exit procedures immediately. The words blurred. She read them 3 times and they still didn't quite land, as if they were describing something happening to someone else. The escort was performed by 2 security guards, one young and deeply uncomfortable, the other older and professional, who walked her to her locker while the entire floor pretended not to notice. She removed her personal items, a photo of Miguel from 3 years ago, a water bottle with Seattle General ICU printed on the side, the challenge coin she kept hidden in the inner pocket of her locker. She changed out of her scrubs in the employee bathroom, her hand steady even as her mind spiraled. The scrubs went into a canvas bag. The badge went into a plastic envelope. She walked past the nursing station without looking at anyone, and nobody looked at her. The drive home took 43 minutes in afternoon traffic. Katie pulled into the driveway of the small 3-bedroom house on Maple Street that she and Miguel had rented for the past 3 years, nothing memorable, nothing that would attract attention, everything designed to be temporary, and sat in the car for 7 minutes before she could make her legs function. Inside, the house was quiet in the way that empty houses become quiet. She moved to the kitchen table, the same table where she'd helped Miguel with homework every night, where they'd shared Sunday morning breakfast, where she'd promised him stability, and Saturday. She was still wearing her hospital badge from the parking lot, still in the clothes she'd changed into, still wearing the smell of antiseptic and fear. The crying started without permission, without warning, without the careful control she'd maintained for 8 months and 13 years before that. Her shoulders shook. Her breath came in gasps. The kind of crying that comes only after you've used up all your reserves, all your strength, all the careful compartmentalization you've built your survival on. She had no idea how long she'd been sitting there when Miguel opened the front door, his key turning in the lock, his backpack hitting the floor with a soft thud, his voice calling out the same greeting he called every school day, "Mom. I'm home." His footsteps stopped when he saw her. He was 14, old enough to recognize that something fundamental had broken, not old enough to understand what. "Mom? Why are you home? What happened?" His voice cracked with the particular terror that children carry when they realize their parent is fragile. Katie lifted her head, tried to compose herself, tried to find words that would mean nothing. "I lost my job, mijo. It's okay, we'll figure it out." The words sounded hollow, a recording of someone pretending confidence. Miguel's face shifted into something older than 14, something determined, something that looked exactly like hers when she'd had to make impossible decisions. "Sit here," he said. Not a request. A command. "Don't move." He disappeared down the hallway toward her bedroom before she could ask what he was doing. Katie heard the closet door open, heard the sound of his sneakers against the wooden floor as he climbed her storage shelf, heard the cardboard box slide forward. Her hands went numb. She'd been explicit, had repeated it 100 times, had made him swear, never in that closet. Never that box. Not until you're older. Not until it's safe. He emerged carrying the showbox like it contained something precious, which it did in ways he could never fully understand. The weight of her entire erased life compressed into a box smaller than a pair of running shoes. Miguel set it on the table in front of her, his hands shaking slightly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her recognize how much of his father was in him, that same fierce loyalty, that same refusal to accept injustice. "They fired you for saving someone's life," Miguel said quietly. "That's wrong. And I'm going to prove it." Katie's voice came out as barely a whisper. "You don't understand what you're doing. I'm not supposed to exist. These things, they are classified. If people start asking questions, if this gets exposed, then they'll know the truth," Miguel said. "That my mom is a hero." He was already reaching for his phone, already searching for the hospital administrator's contact information, and Katie realized in that moment that she'd spent 14 years trying to protect her son from her history, and he'd just spent 14 seconds deciding to claim it. She should have stopped him. She should have reached across the table and taken the phone away, should have insisted on her invisibility, should have maintained the careful fiction of the woman she'd pretended to be. Instead, she watched her son dial the number, watched him wait for someone to answer, watched him straighten his shoulders the way she'd taught him without ever meaning to teach him anything except how to be small and forgettable. "I need to schedule an emergency meeting with the hospital administrator," Miguel said when the phone picked up. His voice had changed, something about it had become more solid, more real. "My name is Miguel Rodriguez. My mom is Katie Rodriguez, and she was fired today from your nursing staff. I think you need to know why before it's too late." He paused, listening. "She saved someone's life last night. A person who was dying. She performed a procedure that the doctors were too scared to do, and she saved him, and now your hospital is destroying her for it. I have proof. It's important proof. Tomorrow? Can we do tomorrow? Because right now I'm 14 and I'm angry, and if you make me wait longer than that, I'm going to post everything to social media and let the internet find the story themselves." Katie closed her eyes. Her son had just made a choice that couldn't be unmade, had pulled her ghost into the light, had decided that her sacrifice meant something worth defending. Outside the kitchen window, Portland's afternoon rain had begun to fall, steady, determined, the sound of water against glass like something trying desperately to get inside. She opened the showbox without touching its contents, staring at the medal she'd never been allowed to wear, the challenge coin she'd hidden for 11 years, the physical proof of a life she'd been ordered to erase. Tomorrow someone would see this. Tomorrow someone would start asking questions. Tomorrow everything would begin to unravel, and she would have to decide whether to fight or disappear again. She reached across the table and squeezed her son's shoulder. "We do this together," she said. "From now on, we do this together." Miguel appeared in the hospital administrator's office at 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, carrying a showbox wrapped in duct tape, his mother's explicit instructions echoing in his head, "Never look inside, Miguel, promise me you'll never look *." But what he'd found in the back of her closet 3 hours earlier had overridden every instruction she'd ever given him. His hands trembled as he set the box on the conference table, but his voice was steady. 13 years of watching his mother absorb punishment without flinching had taught him how to do the same. "Mom, they need to see these," he said, and when he opened the box, the room didn't just go quiet. The air pressure changed. The sound of his own heartbeat became audible in that silence. The Navy Cross lay on top, its ribbon the color of arterial blood, and beneath it, 2 silver stars catching the fluorescent light like shards of glass. The hospital administrator's face went pale. The legal counsel, a woman who'd spent 30 years protecting institutions from liability, stopped mid-breath. But the Pentagon liaison, the man who'd arrived that morning at Colonel Hendrick's frantic call to an old emergency contact, a contact that shouldn't have existed because it had been classified since 2009, he stared at the medals for exactly 4 seconds before speaking a single word that made Katie's eyes close like a shutter closing on a burning house. "Lighthouse," he said. That was her call sign. That was the name she'd been ordered to bury along with her identity, the operational designation that proved she'd existed in a place that officially never saw combat, saving lives in a mission that had been redacted from every database except one, the kind of database that doesn't have a physical office or a public phone number. Katie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That was the only reaction anyone saw. The hospital's security chief, a former Marine gunnery sergeant with scars on his knuckles that matched Katie's, snapped to attention with the kind of force that made his coffee cup topple and spill across the mahogany table, the brown liquid spreading like a stain he couldn't stop. "Master Chief Petty Officer on deck," he said, his voice hoarse with something between recognition and horror at how close he'd come to escorting her out like she was just another employee terminated for cause. 3 other security guards who'd been present for Katie's firing the day before suddenly couldn't meet each other's eyes. They understood now what they'd been part of, understood that they'd just physically removed from the building someone who'd done things none of them would ever be qualified to comprehend. The 3-star general opened a tablet with a screen that glowed like it was holding classified fire, records that technically didn't exist in any official capacity, and he read aloud with the precision of a man delivering a eulogies at Arlington. 14 commendations. He paused. For Purple Hearts. Another pause. And a Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during Operation Sandstone, Baghdad, 2009. The room held its silence like a breath held too long underwater. The general's voice dropped half an octave. "You extracted 12 personnel from a compromised black site with hostile forces closing from 3 directions. One of those personnel was Major Paul Hendricks, Air Force pilot, who took a round in the shoulder during exfil. You carried him 3 miles through enemy territory while sustaining a gunshot wound to your own upper back and a fragmentation injury to your left hand." The general looked directly at Katie. "You were the only extraction team member officially reported killed in action. The operation was buried so completely that even the Pentagon's official casualty records show you as KIA, status resolved. That's the kind of erasure that happens to operations that never occurred." Colonel Hendricks had been wheeled down from recovery by an orderly who had no idea he was watching the most important reunion of his life happen in a conference room on the 3rd floor, and when he lifted his right forearm, the tattoo trembled in the light, *Rodriguez*, just her last name, inked in navy blue ink that had cost him a $47 tattoo on his 2nd week of convalescence at Walter Reed when his hands had steadied enough to hold still long enough for a needle. He was crying, which military men of his generation weren't supposed to do, but he'd spent 11 years trying to find her, 11 years operating under the absolute certainty that she was dead because that's what the classified report said, and now her son was standing in front of him holding proof that she'd lived every single day he was alive because she'd made the choice to carry him when any rational person would have left him behind. "I've looked for you," he said, his voice breaking across those 4 words like a radio signal losing clarity. 14 years I've been trying. I was told you died in the same explosion that took out the compound. I inked your name before I could move my fingers right because I needed something to remember you by, and then I spent every year after that trying to trace you through the VA, through the Pentagon, through every classified database I could access with my clearance, but they said you were gone. They said you were." He stopped, couldn't finish it. The room held silence for 10 full seconds. Not the silence of awkwardness or discomfort, but the silence of weight, the kind of silence that carries density, that presses down on everyone in it like they're standing at the bottom of something very deep. The men in suits understood they were standing next to a legend. The security guards understood they'd watched a ghost become solid. The Pentagon liaison understood that the woman he'd been authorized to find and either rehabilitate or permanently silence had been the real person all along, had been so thoroughly erased that she'd been marked dead in her own home country, and now she was breathing in front of him, and the weight of those 11 years of her living invisibly pressed down on all of them like atmosphere. But what they didn't know yet was that Whitfield's calculated move to destroy her had already begun to unravel in ways even his network couldn't control. The investigation he'd weaponized against her, the board-mandated credentialing review designed to expose her background as fraudulent, was still running, and it was still pulling at threads, but the Pentagon liaison had made a single phone call to Seattle General's legal counsel before stepping into that conference room, pointing out that an unusual pattern had appeared in the hospital's Medicare billing over the past 4 years, specifically among veteran patients, specifically in cases where Dr. Marcus Whitfield had been the attending physician. 72 hours. That's all it took for forensic auditors to trace the first thread and find it led to a consulting firm that had invoiced Seattle General for $847,000 in specialty case reviews that had never actually occurred, that employed no staff, that existed only on paper and in bank transfers routed through 3 shell accounts to Whitfield's personal investment portfolio. The auditors kept pulling, and the pattern expanded. Inflated billing codes on cardiac patients, pneumonia cases coded as acute respiratory failure with ICU-level charges, straightforward procedures billed as emergency interventions. It was systematic. It was 4 years deep. It was Medicare fraud on a scale that federal investigators took personally. The FBI arrived on Friday with warrants, a convoy of unmarked vehicles that pulled into Seattle General's parking lot like a net tightening, and Whitfield's carefully constructed network began to collapse with the velocity of a structure designed to hold only as long as no one asked hard questions. The board members he'd cultivated with favors and political connections suddenly couldn't remember their phone calls with him, couldn't recall promising him advancement, couldn't place his face in their memory without significant prompting from federal agents who had subpoena power and zero patience for selective amnesia. The private investigator he'd retained to discredit Katie's background, the one who'd been building a dossier on a woman who'd been systematically erased by her own government, was now being questioned about his role in potential witness intimidation, about whether his investigation had crossed into obstruction, about whether he understood that tampering with a federal investigation carried specific penalties. Whitfield's hospital privileges were revoked within 48 hours of the warrant service, not through administrative process but through immediate suspension by emergency board decree, the kind of action that happens only when institutional self-preservation takes priority over collegial relationships. His office was sealed. His patient files were seized. His computer was imaged by forensic specialists who found nothing deleted because Whitfield had been too arrogant to believe he could be caught, had believed his position was as permanent as the building itself. 3 days later, when Whitfield tried to enter Seattle General through the main entrance, his hospital badge no longer worked, and security stopped him at the glass doors before he could reach the elevators. The same guards who'd escorted Katie out, who'd felt the shame of that action settle into their bones the moment they understood who they'd been throwing out, now stood with their shoulders back, and one of them, Sergeant Marcus Chen, a 42-year-old former Marine, had let his voice drop into the register that tells a man there's no negotiation available. "You're not authorized to be in this building, Doctor." The title had come out like an insult. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old paper, and he'd backed out through the doors while his hands trembled the way he'd seen Katie's hands tremble through months of public humiliation, and he understood in that moment that composure was power, that the people who could absorb punishment without breaking were the ones who could survive the consequences, and he'd never possessed that quality, had only ever had institutional protection, and now that protection was evaporating. The state medical board moved with unusual speed because federal prosecutors had already started talking to them, and the investigation that should have taken months took 6 weeks. His license was permanently revoked. The malpractice insurance he'd counted on to defend him contained a fraud exclusion clause that his own lawyers confirmed would deny coverage for any federal crimes related to intentional billing fraud, which meant his personal assets would be on the line for settlements and restitution. The house in Lake Oswego with the circular driveway and the wine cellar and the Porsche in the garage began the foreclosure process, and everything he'd accumulated through a career of careful exploitation was liquidated to pay back Medicare, the VA, and the veterans he'd systematically overcharged. But the thing that destroyed him completely was the discovery buried in the second audit report, Katie's thorough chart review. The very competence that had made her a threat to him had documented dozens of billing discrepancies over 8 months, discrepancies that would have exposed him immediately if she'd simply reported them instead of staying silent, and in his desperation to destroy her credibility, he'd forced the investigation that revealed her patterns that proved she'd seen him, had watched him, had been a living audit trail he couldn't eliminate without drawing exactly the kind of attention he'd been trying to avoid. 6 months later, someone who'd worked the night shift at Seattle General spotted him in a Tacoma grocery store parking lot, sitting behind a folding table with a banner that read supplemental insurance policies in letters that had already begun to fade from sun exposure. His hands were shaking, not from anything medical but from the fundamental understanding that he'd become invisible, that nobody looked at him anymore, that he'd spent so many years making others feel small that he'd never considered what it would feel like to be small himself. He'd gained weight, and his shirt was wrinkled, and when the Seattle General employee made eye contact, Whitfield looked away first, a gesture of submission so complete that the employee didn't even need to approach him. The employee just watched for a moment, watched the former doctor sitting alone at a folding table trying to explain insurance coverage to pedestrians who moved through the parking lot like water around a stone, indifferent to his existence, and then the employee turned and walked into the store, leaving Whitfield to understand what Katie had understood for 11 years. Invisibility was the cruelest punishment of all, but unlike Katie, Whitfield had never done anything to earn the grace of being invisible for a cause larger than himself. "I'm going on break," the employee muttered to a colleague inside the store, which wasn't true, was just the only thing they could think to say to convince themselves they'd actually seen something worth acknowledging. Then Katie stood in her new office at Seattle General, 6 months after Miguel carried that showbox into a conference room and changed everything, and the nameplate on the door read Katie Rodriguez, Master of Science, USN, RET, Director of Emergency Services. The hospital had created the position specifically for her after the Pentagon negotiated her official retirement status, which meant she existed again, had a service record again, had a name that appeared in databases instead of being burned out of them. That tarnished challenge coin, the one she'd clutched in the supply closet while her hand shook with restraint she couldn't afford to release, now sat on her desk in a small wooden frame, and she could look at it every single day knowing that the world finally understood what it meant. She touched it once before leaving for the day, running her thumb over the worn insignia like prayer, like benediction, like coming home. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, subscribe to see more of these reversals, more of these moments where the quietest person in the room turns out to be the one holding everything together. Like this video, comment with one word, *lighthouse star. Thank you for watching.